morning. How's everyone doing today? Doing good? Excited to be in church today? Woo, all three of you, yes. I'm just kidding. I'm an introvert, and so whenever I'm like in church and whoever's preaching like tries to get you to like say stuff or I get really uncomfortable. So I'm sorry if many of you are uncomfortable just now. I know how that feels. So I'm just glad you're all here. So anyways, I'm really thrilled to be up here talking to you guys today about this new series that we have been in for the past couple weeks called Just My Type. We're diving into the Enneagram. Who all in here has taken their Enneagram test so far? All right, so some of you. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, or maybe you haven't been here the past couple of weeks, the Enneagram is this ancient typing system. It's kind of like a personality test. I mean, it is, but it's way more than that and goes way deeper than that. But it just basically, in the Enneagram, we find that there are 9 personality types, or basically 9 different ways to view the world. And so basically you take this test and you find out what type you are, and then it tells you all kinds of awesome information about yourselves. And it's been so fun doing this series here and talking with so many of you, hearing about what number you are and the things that you're learning about yourself and about your relationship with others through the information the Enneagram has to offer us. And I only discovered the Enneagram just a couple of years ago, so I feel like I have barely scratched the surface of all the information that is out there. For those of you that have maybe dove into it a little bit more, you know that it is kind of like a rabbit hole. It just keeps going and going and going, and there is so much information and so many podcasts and books and things that are written around it. And I got to say that even though I haven't learned a ton, what I have learned and the way that I've dove into it and sort of discovered more about myself, it has been so helpful. It has really propelled me forward into this really awesome season of personal growth. It's helped the way I parent. It's helped me in my friendships and in my relationships and with work and all of those things. And so it's been really, really helpful. And I remember when I first took the test, and I know for some people, they take the test and whatever their results are, they're kind of like, oh, that just doesn't feel right. And so some people have to actually study the different types or read the different types and then kind of type themselves and say this, this really resonates more with who I am. Well, for me, that was absolutely not the case. I basically took the test, read the description, and I was like, they wrote this based off of my life. Like this describes me to a T. I am a 9 through and through. Are there any other 9s in the room today? Yes, solidarity with all of you peacemakers. So we get each other. We understand each other. So a 9 is called the peacemaker. And just for those of you that aren't a 9 or don't know a whole lot about the Enneagram, what a peacemaker is this just basically means that for me, internal and external peace is very, very important, and I really hate conflict. Okay, I don't like conflict. I like my life to be really routine. I like it to be easygoing and slow and peaceful. I don't like busyness. I don't like making to-do lists. I don't like having a day planner while I have to plan out every single 5-minute segment of my day. And some people hear that and they're like, how do you even live? How do you even go throughout your day and know what to do if you don't have everything written down? Well, for me, that makes me feel internally chaotic, and so I like things to just be very peaceful and easy. Now, this doesn't mean, one thing that I think can be mischaracterized about 9s is people think that because we don't like conflict, that must mean that we just don't care about things or that we don't have strong opinions. I can assure you that is not the case. I have very strong opinions, and I'm not afraid to share them in environments where I feel safe or where I feel like the conflict that arises is worth the outcome. I definitely am very passionate about what I believe in, but it's sort of a risk versus reward kind of a thing if I'm going to enter into conflict. It has to really be worth it for me to kind of put myself in that situation. And it actually helps that I happen to be married to a man who I don't think he's ever shied away from conflict in his entire life. This way I can kind of send him into the lion's den with telemarketers or door-to-door. You guys, the door-to-door people, I can't do it. It's they come with their polo shirt and the little logo and their clipboard, and I'm like, I know they're going to try to sell me home security, or they want to come get rid of the bugs, and whatever it is, and they're doing their job, and I get that. But for me, it's if they come to the door and Dan's home, I'm like, babe, there's someone at the door for you. And if they come to the door and he's not home, I hide. I'm one of those people, pretend like I'm not home. Because it's also I know that I'm going to tell them no, But like having to tell them no, then I feel bad about telling them no, and I feel guilty about having to turn them down. So then I feel inwardly chaotic, so it's just not worth it. It's better for me to pretend like I'm not home when they come to the door. So I can send Dan to handle those things, and that's really helpful. Billing departments at hospitals, like I love having him kind of make those phone calls for me, So the other day, it's so funny, my 9ness really came through the other day. There was an incident that had occurred, and we needed to confront something, and we needed to kind of share our frustrations and really try to get some resolution with this conflict that had come up. And we were both really frustrated, and we knew it needed to be addressed. And so I was sitting at the kitchen table, ironically, working on this message, like when this was happening. And Dan came home for lunch, and he decides to go ahead and make this phone call. So he's like, he's on the phone pacing like he does whenever he's like kind of in a, intense moment. And I'm like sitting at the table, and he was being super respectful. It's not like he was yelling or getting angry or anything like that, but he was being very brutally honest about our frustrations, the way that this person had made some mistakes that affected us. And it's like, so as he's talking and he's like sharing all these things, and I can't even hear I'm not even face to face with this person. I can't even hear what they're saying. And I am like slowly slinking down in my chair, so uncomfortable at this conflict that is occurring on this phone call in the room with me. And I just thought it was so funny that I'm working like on this message about the Enneagram and about my type and being non-confrontational as this conflict is happening, and it made me so uncomfortable. And it's funny because in our private conversations, like I said, I have very strong opinions, and I want things to be taken care of. And so I'm like, babe, this is not right. And we have got to talk to them about this. We have to tell them what they did, how it wasn't right, how we felt. You go get them, you do this, we got to let them know. And then he's on the phone, and I'm like, okay, bye. It was like, I just can't, I get very passionate, but then if I actually have to engage in the conflict, it's like, I am out. Like, I just can't do this. And so this is, really my response to conflict most of the time, is I do whatever I can to avoid it. It's really rare for me to be confrontational. I usually, like, if someone brings me the wrong meal in a restaurant, I don't even complain. I just eat it. And it's not because I'm afraid of conflict, it's because it's just the lack of inner peace I will feel in that moment is just not worth it to me. Like, it's just not worth me making a big deal out of something that in that moment I'm like, it's fine, I can just deal with it. And the thing is for me that keeping myself and keeping those around me at peace is just more important to me than the conflict. That it matters very much to me. And this is one of the things that I have learned about myself with the Enneagram. I always knew that I was non-confrontational, but I never fully understood why and where that came from until I started diving in to the Enneagram. And I've realized through this process how much about myself that I actually don't know, which is really funny because, have any of you ever experienced that where you like realize, oh, wow, I didn't know that about myself, or I learned something new about myself. You would think that because we are us, that we would know ourselves a whole lot better than we do a lot of the time. But I've found with this, there's actually so many things that I have been enlightened by that I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that's why I did that. I didn't know that's why I thought that way or why I responded that way. And it's been such an awesome journey into self-discovery. And I think that the important thing about it is once our eyes are open to that information, and when we start to realize these things about ourselves that maybe we didn't realize before, then we can begin this really helpful journey of self-discovery that will help lead us to being fully who we are, to being our true selves. And the thing is, it's only when we truly know who we are that we can bring our full selves to this world. In order to be fully who we are, we have to know who we are. And when we do this, you and your relationships in this world will all be better for it. And when I think about Jesus, and I think about when Jesus talked about how he wants us to have abundant life, I can't help but think that this is part of it, because there is this richness and this fullness and this abundance that we experience when we're able to bring our full selves to the world. And I really think that this is something that Jesus was talking about when he was talking about wanting us to have abundant life. And honestly, it's from this ability to have this full and healthy relationship with our true self and really know who we are, all of our other relationships are going to flow out of that. They're all going to flow out of that. Last week, Steve, if you weren't here last week, I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to it. I feel like we say that all the time, but it really was really good last week. And he talked about the Enneagram as it relates to our relationships with each other and how we're all wired so differently, but how we need to celebrate those differences. We need to celebrate our uniqueness so that we can see the beauty that there is with, when we come together all operating as our true selves. And he said one thing that really resonated with me last week, and it was this. He said, you'll never have healthy relationships with others when you have a dysfunctional relationship with yourself. And he said that, and I was like, oh, that's so good. And then I just kept thinking about it, like all that day and all the next day, about how true that really is and how I've even seen that play out in my own life. There have been times where relationships that I have with either friendship, with friends or family, have been negatively impacted because I had a healthy relationship with myself. Because I had an unhealthy relationship or an unhealthy view of myself. It negatively impacted those relationships. And maybe some of you have been in that same place where you've seen that happen in your own life. And so today, because of that, I really want to lean into and talk about our relationship with ourselves. And my question, kind of overall question today, is what does it look like to pursue a healthy relationship with ourselves? What does that look like? How do we do that? And there's been some things that as I've been sort of on this journey of figuring out who I am, and there's been some things that I have discovered have been really helpful for me, some things that have helped kind of move me forward. And so I just want to share those with you this morning. And the first thing is, in order to have a healthy relationship with yourself, you have to get to know yourself. You have to get to know yourself. Because you can't have a healthy relationship with someone that you don't know. And so you have to get to know who you are. And like I said before, I was amazed to discover how much about myself I didn't know, or maybe I just didn't have language for, or I had never slowed down enough to actually process and dig deep and see why I thought the things that I did and why I was the way that I was. But now we have these mountains of information at our disposal that we can dive into to really figure out who we are and why we operate the way we do and why we move through the world the way that we do. And the thing is, we're not here to say that the Enneagram is the only way that you can do this, but it is a really, really, really helpful tool. And I know a lot of people that have really benefited from it, and not to be dramatic, but honestly, I feel like I have experienced some major life change because of what I have learned through this process. And the thing is, the first step with having a healthy relationship with yourself is you have to truly know who you are and how you are wired. So whether you use the Enneagram or some other tool, I would really encourage and challenge all of us to go on this journey of self-discovery. Invest the time into getting to know yourself. It's one of the most important things that you can ever do. And another thing that I have found, that part of getting to know who you are will mean letting go of who you are not. You're going to have to let go of who you are not. So often we can live with other people's expectations of who they think we should be. We live with that weight on our shoulders. Or sometimes we put unrealistic expectations on ourselves of who we think we're supposed to be. And if we don't think we're fitting into this nice and neat little box of who others or who ourselves we have told ourselves we're supposed to be, then it's like we don't know who we are. And we hang on to these things and we try to fit into this mold that we were never meant to fit into. And I did this for a really, really long time. When I was in Bible school and studying to be, a pastor and a leader in the church, from my perspective, my perception was there was a certain kind of leader that was elevated and celebrated. It was like, if you want to be a good leader, you have to do and be X, Y, and Z. And there wasn't a lot of wiggle room in that from my perception. And one of those things was that if you wanted to be a good leader, that meant you had to have the kind of personality where you could just own a room. Almost like one of those kind of dominating, very strong personalities. That if you wanted to be a good leader, that's kind of the personality that you had to have. If you wanted to be a good leader, you had to be really willing to call people out on their stuff, man. You had to be able to confront people and really call people out when they weren't living up to how they were supposed to be. And I was like, that sounds like a lot of confrontation to me. Another thing was, from my perception, was that if you wanted to be a good leader, you had to keep your schedule jam-packed, because if you weren't busy, then you weren't effective. If you had downtime, if you didn't have every single 15-minute increment of your day planned out, then you were missing out on opportunities, and there's no way that you could be a good leader if you weren't fulfilling all of that. And so for me, did I mention that I'm a 9? Okay, did I mention that? I'm an introverted 9, okay? I don't have a dominating personality. I hate confrontation. I don't want to call people out on their stuff. Like, I don't like being busy. I like my life to be slow and easygoing and peaceful. And so when I'm hearing all of these things saying that this is what a good leader is, and maybe that wasn't verbally communicated, but when when the person that is that type of personality is the one that's celebrated and lifted up as being the example of the leader, it's really difficult to not feel like you have to measure up to that. And so for a long time, I tried to squeeze myself into this mold that I just didn't fit into, but I felt like I had to, because if I wanted to be a leader, that's what I had to be. And I struggled for a long time, and I ended up exhausted. I ended up frustrated, and just kind of resigned myself to the fact that there's no way that I can ever be a good leader. That's just not who I am. I can't do that. And I tried so hard for so long and was so frustrated, even to the point where when we came down here and started this church, and for the first, probably 4-5 years of this church being in existence, I shrunk back majorly from leading because I didn't feel like I had what it takes. And so I didn't step into that role that I could have stepped into and should have, because I thought I wasn't good enough. I wasn't enough. And maybe you've experienced that too. Maybe you have times in your life, maybe you're in a place right now where you feel like you have heaped on all of these expectations on yourself, or maybe people in your life have put these expectations on you of who you are supposed to be, and you're tired and you're frustrated from trying to fit into a mold that you just were not designed to fit into. And today I want to tell you that it's okay to let that go. It's okay to let go of who you are not so that you can be fully who you are. The only mold that you have to fit into is the mold that's shaped like you. That's just you. Just be you. You don't have to try to be something that you're not. There is a place at the table for all of us, no matter what our personality is, no matter how we lead, no matter how we view life, there is a place at the table for all of us, and you don't have to try to fit into a mold that you were never meant to fit into. And so as we do that, as we start to get to know ourselves and let go of who we're not and really move toward who we are, another thing for me that has been really important to do, that I want to challenge you today, is to learn to embrace your strengths and your weaknesses. Learn to embrace your strengths and your weaknesses. And this one is so key in having a healthy relationship with yourself. We all have certain areas that we are at our best in. We all have certain areas that we really come alive and shine in. And we also all have those areas that we maybe feel weak in, or things that we struggle with, or even things that we may not be proud of. We all have both of those things, and the Enneagram is really great for helping us figure out what those things are. When we figure out our type, we get to see all the positive traits that come along with that, all of the strengths, all of the things that we are really good at due to this God-given personality that we have. And it's so beneficial for us to be able to see those things and recognize them, and then own them and walk confidently in those strengths, to walk confidently in those gifts and abilities and perspectives and all those unique things about us that make us us. It's so good for us to walk confidently in those things, to embrace those strengths, to not shrink back, to say, this is who I am, and this is what matters to me, and this is what I'm good at, and to move forward confidently in those things. We all have unique talents and ideas and perspectives and opinions to bring to the table that can add so much value to our lives and to those around us. And we see this illustrated by Paul in the scriptures so beautifully as he talks about what it looks like to be the body of Christ. We find it in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 4, 10, and 11, and it says this: God's various gifts are handed out everywhere, but they all originate in God's Spirit. Each person is given something to do that shows who God is. Everyone gets in on it. Everyone benefits. All kinds of things are handed out by the Spirit to all kinds of people. I love that everyone gets in on it and everyone benefits. When we are able to use these things that we have to offer the world, when we use them and walk confidently in them, everyone benefits. The Enneagram also helps us to see how our type can best utilize our energy, how we can be most effective and feel at our best. It's so helpful to help us understand these things. But then on the flip side, the Enneagram also addresses our weaknesses and these potential moves that we can have toward areas of unhealth and unhealthy behavior. And that stuff isn't as much fun to talk about. It's like, I like to read my type where it's like, oh, you're this and you're this, and it's like, these are ways that you can benefit others, and this is how you're going to be good to the world. I'm like, yay! And then when it's like, talks about the weaknesses, you're like, the Enneagram is stupid. I hate the Enneagram. We don't enjoy as much learning about our areas of weakness. And to kind of give an example of that, so all 9 types on the Enneagram have what's called a root or a core sin. So it's like this tendency that particular personality type has to move toward unhealthy behavior in certain circumstances. So did any of you, when you were reading the description of your Enneagram number, get to that part and like read some of the like unhealthy tendencies and you were like, ew, and like kind of felt very exposed, because it's like, it makes you mad, but it's also really true, I had so many moments like that. For example, let's look at the root sin of a 9, okay? So the root sin of a 9 is sloth. Cool. Awesome. That's exactly what I want to be called, is a sloth, Because who wouldn't want to be called that, right? Like, that's so not offensive. I'm like, I want to be, this lazy sloth, right? And what's so funny is a few years ago, this was before I even took the Enneagram, so I didn't know like what my number was at this time, but it like must have been fate because I actually have a picture to show you of me with my root sin in the flesh. I just thought you'd appreciate this. This is an actual sloth right here. So this is like the Enneagram 9 sloth right here with a real sloth right here, okay? But the thing is, this isn't what I don't think about this cute, cuddly little guy when I hear the word sloth, okay? I read that on my profile, and it made me mad. I was like, oh, no, I'm not lazy. I'm like, I don't want to be known as lazy, right? Being called lazy, for as long as I can remember, has been something that really bothers me. One of my kids figured that out when they were younger. And when they would get mad at me, so what'd you do all day, Mom? Just sit around? Because they knew that was going to be something that was going to like really get under my skin, right? It has always bothered me. And I think part of it, as I've learned more about myself through this process, I think part of it is I get insecure because I think people are going to mistake my desire for a peaceful life with laziness. So for a long time, that has really bothered me. And then thanks, Enneagram, you go and call me a sloth. You brilliant ancient typing system, you think you're so smart with your wings and your types and it's like, fine, be that way. But here's what I've learned about this, is the sloth tendency or the laziness, it's not so much about a physical laziness, although it can flesh out that way, but it's more about this falling asleep to myself that I can do when I face painful or hard or stressful circumstances. I will numb out and sort of retreat within myself. I can numb out with Netflix with the best of them, man. Like, it's my job. Like, I can get sucked into a good series because it enables me to escape reality and to push that out and not have to deal with the thing that's causing me pain or stress. When things in life get hard, or whether there's internal or an external lack of peace, this is 100% my defense mechanism. And anyone close to me will tell you, yep, that's exactly what I do. I'll push my friends away. I won't like make an effort in my friendships. I will disengage from my marriage. I won't connect with my kids because in numbing out to myself, I'm also numbing out to everybody else around me. So this is one thing that I can have a tendency to move towards in unhealth. And then also each type has what's called a shadow side. And this refers to, there's 2 numbers that each type can move to, whether they are in stress or whether they are secure. And when I am in stress, I intuitively move toward the unhealthy behaviors of a 6. Okay, so not only do I have the whole sloth laziness thing going on, But then when I am stressed, oftentimes I will start to move towards these unhealthy behaviors. Any sixes in the room? Any other sixes? A few of you? So when I get stressed, I get really anxious. I deal with severe self-doubt. It's like everybody hates me. None of my friends like me anymore. I'm terrible, I get real pessimistic. I tend to imagine worst case scenario for everything. So that's some, it's pretty unhealthy mindsets to drift into when I'm stressed. And I do it in circumstances that are more serious, but I also do it in small ways. I just did it this week, actually. See, one of the things, I love getting up here on Sundays and preaching. I love it. It's one of my favorite things. It gives me life. I am not the most gifted communicator by any stretch of the imagination, but I am confident in the gift that God has given me, and I enjoy doing it, and I love getting up here. Now, prepping said messages is another story for me. It stresses me out really bad, and I don't feel like I'm very good at it, and so in those moments, I start to feel stress. And this happened to me, and really every single time I have to speak without fail, I go into stress mode when I'm prepping, and I start to self-doubt, and I get anxious, and imposter syndrome sets in, and before I know it, I'm a terrible, horrible preacher, and I shouldn't even be a pastor anymore, and I should probably just move across the country and never see anybody here again. And I'm not dramatic at all, okay? It's real. Like, that is where my brain goes in moments of stress. And if this is how I respond in minor times of stress, just imagine what I'm like in like a major stressful situation. So these are definitely not things that I'm proud of. And it's hard for me to admit to myself that I struggle in these ways. And I imagine we all feel this way about our unhealthy behaviors or these root or core sins that the Enneagram talks about. I think we all feel that way about areas in our life where we feel like we're weak. I mean, who wants to face into their darker side? Who wants to do that? We like to hear about all the positive things about ourselves and the ways that we can be at our best, but if we stop there, if we stop at only the positive things and our strengths, we are missing out on a huge opportunity for growth in our life. We must also learn to embrace our weaknesses. We have to learn to embrace our weaknesses, and the Enneagram has a way of shining a light on those things. It's like holding up a giant mirror showing you the good, the bad, and the ugly. Richard Rohr says this about the Enneagram. He says, the Enneagram tells it like it is, and our healing and maturing always begin with our acknowledging what's there. That's so good, right? Like you can't be healed from something that you won't admit to. You can't change and mature if you don't acknowledge and see the need for growth. And I realize this is way easier said than done, at least for me. Way easier said than done. And so often we can see our weaknesses and these times when we tend to move toward unhealthy behavior, and we can feel so much shame surrounding that. We can carry so much shame. And we think if we can just ignore them, or if we bury them or pretend they're not there, then maybe they'll just go away and we won't have to deal with them. We won't have to admit that they're a part of who we are. But here's the problem with that when we deny the not so pretty parts of us, we end up dismembering ourselves. We end up living fractured. And having a healthy relationship with ourselves requires us to acknowledge and embrace all the parts of ourselves, even the parts we may not be proud of. And when I'm talking about embracing our weaknesses here, I'm not talking about using your weaknesses as an excuse to do things that hurt yourself or other people. I'm not talking about making excuses. But I'm talking about recognizing that these are tendencies that we have, whether we like it or not, it's there. And so we need to embrace that as part of who we are so that we can then move forward into the healing and the change that we want to see. And then once, we're getting to know who we are, and once we're establishing who we're not, and we're really moving forward into who we are, and then as we're learning to really embrace our strengths and our weaknesses, then we can actually move toward wholeness. We can move toward wholeness because the point isn't to live fragmented, it's to live whole. And the more we get to know who we are, the easier it is for us to live as our true selves. And the more we live as our true selves, the closer we get to wholeness. And the closer we get to wholeness, the closer we get to living as God intended. That's God's plan, is for us to live whole. We can find this wholeness, this call to wholeness throughout Scripture. We see when Jesus, in the book of Matthew, when Jesus is giving his famous Sermon on the Mount, at one point he says this, in Matthew 5:48, he says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And this used to make me so mad. I would read that and be like, be perfect? Are you kidding me? That's impossible. And so what I would do is I would read that and I would think, okay, well, clearly Jesus is saying be perfect, so I got to strive to be perfect. So that resulted in a lot of striving and performing and doing and trying to measure up and trying to be enough. But what I was missing was the word for perfect comes from the Greek word telos, which means whole. It means whole. Jesus is calling us to wholeness here, not to perfection. God is 100% aware of your humanness. 100% aware of it. Nothing you do or say or think or no way that you respond or no way that you treat another person or no internal dialogue you have with yourself is a surprise to God. God is 100% aware of our humanness. And I love this quote by Eugene Peterson. He says this, "We don't become more spiritual by becoming less human. In fact, I believe God delights in our humanness. God created us as humanity, and God delights in us. And I believe one of the best things we can do for ourselves spiritually is to fully embrace our humanity, not try to run from it or sever the parts that we don't like. Sure, we move forward towards change. Sure, we want to get better and we want to treat people and honor one another and honor ourselves, but we don't want to fracture ourselves in the process. And part of embracing our humanity is to let go of our strive toward perfection. Because God doesn't expect us to be perfect. God just wants us to be whole. That's what God wants. He wants us to be whole, to live wholeheartedly, to experience wholeness in all of its beauty and all of its humanness. That's what God wants for us. And part of being whole means accepting and acknowledging and owning all of the parts of ourselves. And one really cool, powerful thing happens when we start to do this. When we move towards wholeness, that shame that we heap on ourselves for those weaknesses, for those areas of struggle, that shame loses its power. When we move towards wholeness, that shame loses its power. When we begin to understand who we are and why we respond to things the way that we do and what our tendencies are, we have the power to then use that information to bring about that change that we want to see. Self-awareness is a beautiful thing. It helps us to actually take responsibility for our actions. It's not like we're trying to deflect or make excuses, but while we take responsibility, it also keeps us from drowning in shame. So when I recognize the fact that one of my tendencies, when I feel stressed or when life is hard or when something painful happens, and I know that because keeping internal peace really matters to me, so my default then is to go in this sloth tendency. My default is to numb out and to turn inward and to push everybody away because I'm trying so desperately to keep the peace within myself because I know this about myself. Now, when those circumstances come and I feel myself heading in that direction, I have the ability to say, you know what, I'm going to make a different choice. And even though this is what I want to do, instead, I will choose to press into my relationships. I will choose to not disengage from my marriage. I will choose to connect with my kids, even when all I want to do is sit around and watch Netflix and not think about it. But because I've learned this about myself, because I've embraced it as part of who I am, and I really, really, really want to move toward wholeness, I can have a different outcome to that story. And we can all have that. And instead of feeling shame about our weaknesses, we can acknowledge that they're there and then choose to move in the direction of health and wholeness. So as we close today, my question for you is this: what are some ways that you can pursue a healthy relationship with yourself? As you go about your day, go about your week, as you think about the things that you've learned today, what are some simple steps that you can take toward pursuing a healthy relationship with yourself? Maybe you need to start with the whole getting to know yourself part. Maybe you do that through taking the Enneagram. Maybe you jump into a small group that we're talking about the Enneagram so you can dive deeper into it. Maybe you set aside time to invest for self-discovery and really getting to know who you are. Maybe you need to really start embracing and leaning into your strengths. Maybe you've never done that. Maybe you don't even know what you're good at or what makes you come alive, so maybe you need to start exploring that. Find a local organization you can volunteer with to really let those strengths soar. Or maybe today you fall more in the camp of you need to acknowledge and accept your weaknesses, to learn to embrace them and to find freedom from the shame that you're carrying surrounding those things. But for all of us, I think we need to remember we got to stop trying to hide the parts of ourselves that we aren't proud of and instead move toward the wholeness that Jesus invited us into. And that's what we can find when we go on this journey of self-discovery and really figure out who we are and why we're wired the way we are and moving towards wholeness. The wholeness is the goal. It's the goal. So wherever we all find ourselves today, may we commit to pursuing a healthy relationship with ourselves so that we may live into the freedom and wholeness that God has for us. Amen? Let me pray for you.